Hello, friends. This is Jim here with Science Talk. Want to discuss with you what we see here. Climate change shrinks and fragments salmon habitats in a snow dependent region. So, basically, I'm going to cover with you in discussing this paper here how climate change is impacting species. Specifically, as we will find out in this uh, video presentation, Chinook salmon, also known as king salmon. Okay, let's take a look at the abstract. Climate change threatens biodiversity through global alteration of habitats, but efficient conservation responses are often hindered by imprecise downscaling of impacts. What they mean there is looking at in local regions. That's what they're saying there. Besides thermal effects, warming also drives important ancillary environmental changes, such as when river hydrology evolves in response to climate forcing. Earlier snowmelt runoff and summer flow declines are broadly manifested in snow dependent regions and relevant to socioeconomically important cold water fishes. For example, salmon. Salmon is important food for people. It's also important for commercial fishermen. They catch it and sell it. Here we mechanistically quantify how climate induced summer flow declines during historical and future periods cause complex local changes in Chinook salmon and in Chinook salmon habitats for juveniles and spawning adults. And this is the scientific name. Changes consisted of large reductions in usable habitat area and connectivity between the main channel and adjacent off channel habitats. These reductions decrease the capacity of freshwater habitats to support historical salmon abundances and could pose risks to population persistence in some areas. This kind of is the slam it in your face statement. These reductions decrease the capacity of freshwater habitats to support historical salmon abundances, could pose risk to population persistence in some areas. So, what they're implying here, and they go on to demonstrate in the study, is that we're having less snow, or whatever snow that is occurring melts sooner, runs off sooner, and therefore by the time the salmon go up their natal streams to spawn, they are encountering river levels that then historically are different, lower, in other words. And the other problem is when you have a slowdown in the in the melt runoff, slow down the summer flows, shallower water. The river is shallower. The water is going to warm up more. Salmon like cold water. They like cold water. They need the high dissolved oxygen. But also, if it slows down, you're not going to get basically the flushing. Nice, fast moving. Riverine water helps flush, aerate, by mixing in the oxygen from the atmosphere. It just helps flush out any debris, any fine sediments, algal material, because the fine sediments settle over the eggs. It kills the eggs. That's one of the reasons why damming operations were so deleterious to salmon, because you pack up the river and the river's not flowing. Then you had silt and other fine sediments building up, clogging, covering the eggs, clogging the egg, clogging what we call reds, REDE, that are basically egg beds. So Slower water does not flush out the the habitat, and that poses risk to the salmon eggs, and even to the newly emergent sac fry. So let's take a look at the key points. Warming from climate change accelerates runoff, decreases stream flow during low flow periods in many snow dependent regions. Extended summer low flows reduce and fragment the capacity of freshwater habitats to support historical salmon abundances. This impacts year class strength. It reduces the number of cohorts. If you reduce the number of cohorts, it reduces the number that make it out to the ocean, which then reduces the number that make it back, in the case of king salmon, anywhere from 4 to 7 years later to spawn. Climate adaptation actions for salmon should consider hydrologic changes and floodplain connectivity besides increasing water temperatures. Okay, so then they go into a plain language summary. The large majority of climate change research for aquatic organisms has focused on stream water temperature and discounted the importance of flow changes associated with evolving precipitation regimes. In other words, changing precipitation pattern, changing precipitation amounts, changing precipitation types. Let's put it this way: if it rains in a mountain instead of snowing, well, the rain just runs off. If it snows, it can collect and accumulate, and it slowly melts so that it meets out the cold water throughout the spring and summertime. That's all changing. Using a high resolution stream topographic map that supported a series of link flow and fish habitat quality models, our research describes how observed historical flow reductions and projected future reductions affect local habitat quality, distributions, and connectivity for a salmon population. We demonstrated that as climate change continues to change flow regimes in snow dependent regions, it will cause fragmentation and reduce the overall volume of available habitats in headwater streams where salmon and other cold water fish species spawn and grow during early life stages. Now, before we get into the rest of the paper here, a brief word about the life cycle of a salmon. Most of us are familiar with the salmon that you catch in the ocean. You've got the king salmon or Chinook. You've got the sockeye, you got the chum, you got the pink, right? You got the coho. Those are your five major uh, Pacific salmon. Then you got the Atlantic salmon over on the Atlantic side. But salmon, really interesting. They spend the great majority of their life in the ocean. And in the open ocean. So in the ocean there, they have to have a physiology that's adapted to living in salty, high salinity waters. So their bodies basically have to do what? They have to excrete all the salt and preserve all the water, because their bodies would be, compared to the environment, hypoosmotic to the hyperosmotic environment. So, in other words, there's going to be a tendency of the environment sucking out the fluid from the tissues. So, marine fish have very concentrated urine with very little water in it. It's high concentrating salt because their aim is to preserve water, to maintain some sort of osmotic balance. And there's specialized cells on the gill called chloride cells, along with the kidney that help in all these functionings. A freshwater fish has the exact opposite issue. Their issue is that because now their tissues are hyperosmotic to the hypoosmotic environment. So there's a tendency of the fish just basically sucking in water and having bloated tissues, if you will. So their strategy is to save the salt and get rid of the excess fluid. So they urinate a lot. The urine is very dilute and it's very copious. That's how they balance. So when the spawning salmon return, they lay their eggs. And then the male spreads its milt, it's milt, and okay, fertilizes the egg. They overwinter and they start emerging in the spring. Well, the sac fry, and they have a little yolk sac that they can live off of for a little bit until they start learning to find their own food. Um, they're in fresh water. So they're going to develop the physiology, like I just described, copious, diluted urine. So then they start traveling down the river, feeding and growing, and that's about a year or so of their life. And then they have to, before they can go into the ocean, they have to change their physiology. They have to change the physiology from being adapted in fresh water to now being able to handle salt water. And it's a process called smoltification, because at that point the young are called smolts. And, they can be, anywhere from, six, something like 8 to, you know, 20 centimeters or something like that, depending on the species. But, they kind of look like little miniature salmon. Right? But they have to undergo this smoltification before venturing out into the ocean. Where do they typically undergo this? In estuarine brackish waters, or close to where whatever river their natal river is, where it starts meeting the ocean, where you start getting the mixing. So they undergo that smoltification process, which can be a few months. Then they finally venture out into the ocean, and then they eat and grow and so on and so forth till they get pretty good size, and then they return to spawn. And in the meantime, from sac fry emergence to when they spawn, they're trying to avoid being eaten themselves. Typically have like a 97% mortality. So they finally return to their natal rivers, the natal stream that they hatched out of, smelling their way, using olfaction. And you'll notice that they do what? They just go right from the ocean into the river. They do not take the time to revert. That's a major reason why they spawn and die. They use a lot of energy swimming against the stream. They lay their eggs, spread the gametes, and then they become bear food. The two spend, the physiology can't handle being in fresh water, and they die. So what we're seeing here is that, and they're basically saying we're having fragmentation, so that could prevent their journey down to the ocean. All of the things that they're stating here in the abstract that we just went over is having a negative impact on population numbers. And that's in addition to the other challenges they face from pollution, damming of the rivers, even with the fish ladders and so forth. It's still, it's still other challenges. I'll go into the introduction here. A changing climate pervasively affects life on Earth and is projected to drive to extinction many local populations and some taxa this century, and threaten the habitat of many cold water fish such as salmonids. It leads to changes in temperature and hydrology with biological consequences that are complicated by complex interactions with local habitats and physical conditions. Despite progress in recent decades, we still lack the ability to represent local climatic conditions at the resolutions needed for greatest relevance in ecological risk assessments and strategic application of conservation resources. Challenges are magnified in stream and river environments that are disproportionately biodiverse, but difficult to study given their dynamic physical properties and problems associated with making measurements in flowing water. Well, it depends on how deep, you know, the stream or river under consideration is. If you're interested in velocity, you can stick a flow meter in there. Emergence of new remote sensing and hydrodynamic modeling technologies, however, have enabled bathymetric surveys and analyses of lotic environments to progress rapidly in recent years, and applications are proliferating. Okay, getting an idea of the bathymetric survey, in other words, how deep, what's the topography, what's the the cross section, you know, whatever transects look like, what kind of substrate you have. That's all important information because you can use that to identify what would be suitable spawning areas. Now, loadic is a word I haven't seen in many a year, but it basically means you have two words that are associated with the study, the branch of uh, aquatic ecology called limnology. Limnology is the study of freshwater systems. Limnology is broken down into lotic and lentic, lentic. Lotic is rivers and streams, lentic are lakes. That's what it is. So, anyway, in the Columbia River Basin of the northwestern U.S., rivers provide habitat for world renowned salmon populations and fisheries, but the abundance of most species has declined precipitously due to habitat degradation, fragmentation, overharvest. Right? Habitat degradation, fragmentation, overharvest, and then toxin waters. So this has prompted restoration of efforts, restorative procedures. Hydrologic regimes within the region are snow dependent and climate sensitive, similar to most areas inhabited by salmon throughout North America and Eurasia, because of salmon species requirement for cold riverine environments, which also means, and it's not included here, but I'm going to say it should be included here, high levels of dissolved oxygen. You take, for example, in the southern U.S., you know, silty, muddy waters, slow moving, very warm waters have low dissolved oxygen. Catfish do fine there. You take say a brook trout from uh, northern New Hampshire, northern Maine, and you stick it in that same stream, it's dead. You go up to the stream in northern New England, it's cold, fast flowing, high oxygen levels. So, increasing air temperatures throughout the Northwest in recent decades are linked to reductions in winter snow accumulations, earlier spring snow melt runoff, and declining summer fall flows. Well, increasing air temperature also increases the water temperature, decreasing oxygen levels. I don't think they took that factor into consideration in this study. The summer low flow period is an important bottleneck for most populations that are territorial during juvenile and adult life stages because reductions in water volume enhance resource competition and translate to decrease habitat capacity and population abundance. And if some of the places get the water gets so low that the salmon cannot effectively travel, continue to travel down rivers, for example, that's the fragmentation alluded to earlier, and that presents problems because that will decrease cohort recruitment. If decreases in habitat extent are accompanied by reductions in flow velocities or even stagnant backwater areas with no flow, remaining habitats are also likely to become less productive for juvenile salmon, which feed on passively drifting insects that are delivered at rates commensurate with flow velocities. In other words, the insect lands on the surface of the water, it flows past, the salmon see the movement and they go and snatch it. That's why if you do fly fishing, you don't just plop the fly in there, but you do what? You have to work the fly so that you attract the attention of the whatever salmonid you are trying to catch. And fly fishing is the whole thing of itself. I got only proficient with floating lines. There's some that you have slightly submerged lines. I never was good with those, but for my purposes in northern New Hampshire, originally, yeah, floating lines are fine. 6 pound test. Anyway, and my friend Dan, he used to tie flies. I think he still does, and I never had to buy a fly. And he did some. He makes some really beautiful, beautiful flies. Anyway, I digress. So now they go. They talk about that they're going to investigate the climate-induced summer flow reduction on salmon spawning and rearing habitat, both in-channel and off-channel habitats, which they identify as OCH. So they surveyed a typical Chinook salmon spawning stream in an adjacent floodplain at Bear Valley Creek, Idaho. And this figure here shows that. And using aircraft-mounted water-penetrating green LiDAR system, it's kind of a radar system, detailed 1 square meter resolution and bathymetry was developed, and so forth. So figure 1 kind of lays out the study site. So location of study site in northwestern U.S., floodplain, and B is floodplain topography, and channel bathymetry mapped by the Experimental Advanced Airborne Research LiDAR instrument. Black dots are individual LiDAR elevation measurement points. C shows the spatial pattern of flow velocity in the mainstream channel during a discharge of 1 cubic meter per second. I compare that to the ocean. 1 sphere drift would be 10 to the 6 cubic meters per second. So this is a microsphere drift. So distribution of Chinook salmon spawning habitat quality during a discharge of 1 cubic meters per second. That's D. And then they look at some off-channel rearing habitat as a function of water stages. So let's take a look at these figures here. Okay, I feel like enlarging. So let's just do that here. So they're in Idaho. This is the state of Idaho. As you can see, the rest of the U.S. And this is the system under consideration. And then they show all the branching here. And it's called the Middle Fork Salmon River. So that's what this is. Okay. And then, B was the floodplain topography. So you can see the main channel itself, the flows here. Right? But then there's other areas here is part of the floodplain. Like when there's sufficient snow melt, it overruns the banks, makes a little bit of a floodplain, and then eventually recedes. And then this is your main channel flow this way. And you can see the flow in meters per second. 1.88 is the highest that they have. So this looks like the main channel right here, going this way, and then again with some other little diversionary channels. C is the spatial pattern of the flow velocity, so you can see that there. And D is the spawning habitat quality. So basically, red is not suitable, blue, dark blue, is quite suitable. And you can see some of the dark blue spots here, the light blue spots, not as preferred as this. So why would these be more preferable? Maybe because the stream's a little deeper there. If it's shallow here, there is a danger, even though they require some flow, the danger that the eggs could be swept away. If it's deeper, eggs could be a little more protected. So that's probably what's going on there. There's a couple of these red places here. The salmon aren't going to be spawning there. And then E is the off-channel rearing habitat, and they give you the water elevation. So it looks like brown is the highest at 99.8 meters based on 1957. Green, which seems to be a lot of it, is basically 10 centimeters uh, lower, and that's projected to 2090. And then they have the main channel, and the main channel at 99.7. So looking at this, most of the main channel is at 99.7 meters. That's the elevation. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the study site. Don't know how to describe it. We just kind of did that. And then they go into the methods. They tell you exactly what they did. That's all fine and dandy. I will leave the URL in the comments section. So for those who want to check it out, if you want to look at the supplementary information, you know, you can click on the link and do so at your convenience. Okay, so now let's take a look at the results and discussion. During a recent historical period of 1957 to 2016, average flows in the study reached declined by 19%, approximately 3% per decade, during the summer months of July, August, September. A decrease that was consistent, although smaller, with decline observed that the majority of gauges on unregulated streams in the region during this period, and they references some of the supporting information. This flow decrease affected physical conditions within the main channel used by adults for spawning and in adjacent off-channel areas used by rearing juvenile salmon. Okay, so what they're getting at, the off-channel areas, is that sometimes the juvenile salmon don't want to be swept downstream. So they kind of go off in little off-channel areas, some of the floodplain-like area, slower stream. It's still well aerated, it still has the high oxygen content, but allows them to rest and grab an insect or so every so often. The overall wetted dimension of the main channel decreased by a small amount, about 2 to 3%. And again, decreases at a minus sign. But the average flow velocity through the channel dropped more substantially. That's important. And that's a drop of 17%. Average flow velocity dropped 17%. That will impact the salmon negatively. The surface area of off-channel rearing sites also declined over the same time, about 6%. And they're referencing figure, 2A, B, and C, and we'll look at this in a moment. Importantly, the spatial distribution of these changes was not uniform. For example, the largest drops in the velocity occurred within an approximately 1,000 square meter area composed of riffle channel habitats where adult spawning is usually concentrated. So let's look at figure two, and I'll just jump right into that. Figure two. Okay, so let's look at A. So trend estimated from linear regressions for the historical period 1957 to 2021. Blue lines with pink fill, which is the standard error. So that's these guys here throughout all of these four panels here. In yearly values of average summer reach conditions for Bear Valley Creek under the ensemble mean warming scenario. Reach characteristics are A, discharge and flow velocity, B, wetted area and depth, C, off-channel habitat area, and D, WUA, or weighted usable area for adult spawning and juvenile rearing. Trends over the full study extent are statistically significant. P is less than 0.001. Okay, so Q is discharge, V is velocity. So Q shows a rate of minus 0.01 times the year plus 21.74. So these are the linear equations. S is for the spawning adults, R is for the rearing juveniles. We'll get back to that in a moment. Panel A now. So we have the mean discharge in cubic meters per second. That's given as Q. That's given as the light circles, such as what we see here. Okay? And so we have cubic meters per second going from 1 to 5. And they're comparing it to the decline from 57, 2016, and then they project out to 2040, 2090. The blue dashed line is the regression equation with the standard error. Right? And then they take the black dashed line with the gray area for the standard error is extended outward. And on this side here, we have the mean velocities in meters per second. So we got 5 times e to the minus 6, 1 times e to the minus 5, 1.5 times e to the minus 5, and 2 times e to the minus 5. And what we clearly see is both discharge down here, and velocity are declining. That's what they're showing here for panel A. Panel B, channel water surface area in square meters. Again, looking at the area, the light circles is area, and then the mean depth is the darker circles. And what this is showing, so the mean depth in meters, okay, go from 0.35, 0.4, 0.45, 0.5, is that it declines from Here's the mean depth from basically 40 centimeters down to you know is that about 36 or so centimeters. May not sound like much, 6 centimeters, but when you couple that with the discharge and the velocity, the water level's dropping. 6 centimeters might be enough to cause some problems. And the surface area is also showing a decline, and they give it in square meters, and we see a clearer decline that's projected out through the years. That's what these are showing. It's showing discharge, velocity, area, depth are declining, meaning less usable habitat for the salmon. So let's take a look at the next two panels. Off-channel habitat area. This is where the juveniles might go to hang out and rest for a little bit. And what we see is they're projected, because what they're doing the modeling and they're projecting these results here. So they run the linear regression through that. They take the same data through here, and I do have in all these cases here, and they run the linear regression this way. So that's why these lines appear to be different. But when they did the modeling, and they have all the equations explaining in detail how they do that, when they did the modeling here, and including these same points here, but now run the regression model including these new points here, this is why you get different regression lines in all these cases here. Now, what they do not report here, and I feel they should report it, is what's the R square. Because in this one here, the R square, in fact, in a lot of these, the R square really does not look that great. Probably the best here, but especially the last two panel, the R square would probably not be very high. And then the spawning usable area in square meters is also projected to decline over time. The light circles are for the spawning adults. The darker circles are for the juveniles. They call them rearing. Let's call them juveniles. And this is a dramatic decrease for the spawning adults. This tells us that there will be considerably less usable areas for them to spawn in. They can't spawn. You can't have the next year's cohorts and so forth. And again, the gray is the shading includes the standard error. So what we see from this is over time a decline in discharge amounts, decline in velocity, decline in the depth of the channel, a decline in the area. We also see a decline in the off-channel habitat area, a decline in the usable area for both juveniles and spawning adults. And to me, it's most pronounced, looking at the regression lines, if you look at the slope and so on, it's most pronounced for decline in off-channel and wet use area. This is where it's going to impact the salmon. So this is the summary of this paper, this figure right here. They go on to state, those changes in channel hydraulics also translated to effects on aquatic habitat conditions. For example, a wet usable area of good spawning habitat was reduced by about 10%. That's the figure I just showed you. That occurred while the habitat area for in-channel rearing had a negligible decline. And if you look at it, there is a decline, but not as dramatic as available areas for the spawning adults. These differences in habitat response within the main channel reflect both a stronger dependence of good spawning sites on higher local water velocity and a larger declines in velocity of the spawning sites relative to the rearing areas. Overall, off channel juvenile rearing habitat also declined strongly over time, about 6%, as these rearing areas shrank or became disconnected at lower discharges and water stages. Notice it got cut off from the channel. The off channel habitat is also predicted to begin breaking up into smaller patches, less than 200 square meters, in the future as average water stages decrease, large patches disappear. So you get these more and more smaller isolated patches. Well, if you isolate the salmon there, where are they going to go? And, and then even if they fragment and separate themselves off from the main channel, the juveniles can't even access it to begin with. Maybe then their juveniles get swept away. Who knows? But it reduces what they can use. This is going to stress out the individual fish, stress out the species in toto. So, figure three, let's look at figure three. So, we have percent of total off channel habitat area. And this is basically a bar graph, and they give the size category in the square meters. This is a bar graph. So you got the black is 1957, the dark gray is projected in 2040, and then the light gray, medium gray, is projected for 2090. And we can see some confidence intervals included. So the change in summer off-channel rearing habitat, size frequency distribution between historical and these future projections. And the future projections when the mean water stage height is predicted to decline by 10 centimeters. Whiskers represent the off-channel habitat variability due to 24% discharge uncertainty quantified for future predictions. These guys here. The symmetrical uncertainty of the discharge results in unsymmetric whiskers around the expected off-channel habitat value because off-channel habitat extension is due to the interaction between discharge, stage, and off-channel topography. And they're just giving a distribution here. And what we're seeing is for the, let's look at, say, 2,000, 3,000 square meters, is that in 1957, first of all, this category was the highest appearing category for 1957. And if you compare this category to what the projections are for 2040 and 2090, it's really interesting. They're showing a market decline by 2040, but apparently there might be some rebounding by 2090, but 2090 will still be less than 1957. When you look at areas greater than 6,000 square meters, it's really interesting that we see a slight increase by 2040, but then 2090, it's gone. $10 to $50, $50 to $100, $100 to $200. They're showing slight increases, probably not statistically significant, and we start seeing a decline by the 200 to 500. So what this is really, there's no real clear trend being displayed here. It's basically what size area do you have, and what's what's the projected percent that will have by these years and for that size category. And they said there's a lot of uncertainty in the discharge. So to me, this doesn't show as clearly, just critiquing this does not show as clearly as this graph does. This graph, shows the indication for basically declining habitat availability. In addition to loss of habitat area over time, other ecologically important changes also occur at lower stream discharges. For example, off-channel rearing habitats for juvenile salmon often consist of secondary channels with flows that return to the main channel at downstream connection points. That's what I wanted to show you. That's what I was trying to show you here and here, or here, but this one especially, right? That's what I was trying to show you here. You're like the mainstream, but then you got these offshoots. This is part of the flooding, right? Offshoot areas, off channel habitat, off the main channel. That's what I was trying to show you there. And that's what they're talking about there. As flows decline, one end of these habitats may be severed from the main channel, or they may separate in the middle, causing flows to stagnate and declines in habitat quality for salmon as water temperatures increase. Dissolved oxygen levels decrease. There we go, I mentioned the oxygen. And macroinvertebrate communities adjust in ways that alter the potential food supply. Locations of connection points along the reach depends on subtleties in geomorphic floodplain characteristics, but are often spatially clustered. Once critical low flow thresholds are exceeded, some subreaches experience large local habitat losses and fragmentation of networks, despite the total wetted area remaining relatively constant. Our estimates suggest about 20% of the off-channel rearing habitat will through flowing water was lost between 1957 and 2016. 20% is not insignificant. Observed decreasing historical trends in wetted channel dimensions and salmon habitats are predicted to continue and intensify later this century, with mean summer flows estimated to decline by about 45% in 2040, 72% in 2090, relative to the 57 baseline. If these changes transpire, the amount of main channel habitat for juveniles is again predicted to show relatively small changes compared to the decreasing in spawning and off-channel rearing habitat, 38, 29% respectively. And basically, the expected decreases in um, discharge is expected to decrease the size of habitat patches, which reduce on average by about 46%. Spawning habitats also become fragmented as the number of habitat patches with less than the minimum patch area of 6 square meters, according to the average surface area of a salmon nest, increased by 95% compared to large habitats of good and excellent quality. Summer flow reductions are common to many snow-dependent regions, suggesting detrimental effects not only to the Chinook salmon, but also to other species of salmon, trout, and char that require cold water from snowmelt runoff and are regulated at multiple life stages by density-dependent growth, survival, and reproduction. not to mention a high oxygen level. At rearing juveniles, the fish organize into spatial hierarchies where dominant individuals occupy bioenergetically profitable positions to maximize growth opportunities. Kind of think like bears, fighting for that ideal spot to catch the salmon that jump out of the water. So you got the fish competing for that ideal spot to eat the insects. Similar territorial mechanisms occur at the adult life stage when dominant female establish breeding territories in the best habitats to build a nest, and males compete aggressively for access to the females. Typical thing. Habitat reduction is especially problematic during the summer low flow season when bioenergetic expenditures are greatest. Increased water temperatures increases the metabolic rates. So you need to increase your energy input to counter. And that's what they're talking about to cope with the physiological stresses. Biological responses may take one of several forms, including direct mortality. That's a response caused by increasing female superimposition of nests when spawning is confined to smaller, usable habitat areas. What that means is you get a female, lays her eggs, and another female comes along and lays her eggs right on top of those. And then another female comes by and lays. And what then happens is the eggs at the bottom, the first deposit, basically get their access to well flowing water with the oxygen is decreased, and those eggs will tend to die. So the eggs on top tend to do the best. So if you have you have the smaller habitat usable areas, the females will be finding where to lay the eggs, and they're going to be laying eggs on top of each other. So this will reduce the hatching success rate, and then if you have smaller areas and there's more competition for food, it's going to be a reduction in the juvenile growth rates. It may affect the juvenile emigration rates and timing. Again, part of the phenology uh, branch of science. Reductions in juvenile size at age may contribute to higher mortality rates. In other words, if they don't eat a lot and grow quickly to a pretty decent size, well, they're going to be food for other things. Usually, well, especially true in lakes, but you have things called pickerel and pikes, and they're piscivores. They eat fish. So they'd be looking to chomp on juvenile fish. He also goes on to say that forced emigration is also usually disadvantageous. In other words, you don't want to emigrate before you're ready. Whereas warmer water temperatures may sometimes increase growth because of high metabolic rates if sufficient food is available. Higher fish densities caused by a decrease in rearing habitat could negate the effect. In other words, you have warmer temperatures, your metabolism increases, and you can't get enough food. So if you're lucky, you have a reduced growth rate, only to be eaten by something else later on because you didn't grow fast enough to get big enough, or you metabolically burn out and you just die. So they discuss other issues such as what wildfires find sediments can do to the stream. One thing that typically salmon streams you find is that there's a lot of trees covering the stream. When they start cutting down the tree, you now have open sunlight reaching the stream, warms up the temperature, the water temperature. Not good. Also, the logging activity, well, the trees hold the soil together. Now you're going to have increased erosion increased sedimentation. That clogs the eggs, that kills the eggs. So logging is also not very good for salmon. And here they talk about deposition of fine sediment that would negatively impact spawning habitat by clogging flow through the nest site, reducing embryo survival by decreasing oxygen delivery and waste removal. I mentioned that pretty much at the outset here. Climate induced reductions in the regional capacity of freshwater habitat to support salmon populations or traditional life histories pose unanticipated challenges for conservation strategies that assume reversal of past habitat degradation will be sufficient to ensure long term population persistence. Towards that end, billions of US dollars have been spent on habitat restoration and population conservation efforts in the northwestern US. Okay, then they go on to say what they would like to do for future research. So, what are the conclusions that they have here? Climate change is not only impacting extreme water temperature regime and high elevation spawning and rearing meadow systems like Bear Valley Creek, but is also affecting hydrologic regimes. Expected future summer flows will be lower than historic, which will cause continued reductions in and fragmentation of spawning and rearing and off channel habitat by the end of the century. These predicted negative impacts on habitat extent and distribution will be potentially exacerbated by an increase of late summer water temperature, potentially by deposition of fine sediments, which may also further disconnect the main stem from off channel habitats. So here's an example of climate change because of what it's doing to the snowpack in terms of how much snow or not, what type of precipitation, snow, rain, freezing rain, the amount, and if it's rain, it's going to run off. If it's snow, but a lower amount, then the snowpack is less. It's going to be less to melt later in the, when spring, summer rolls around. So there'll be a decrease in the melt rate down feeding the streams, which is also, when you have snow that melts, that's cold water that helps keep the rivers cold. Well, if it's not much snow there and you got warmer waters, coming down in rain form there, that's going to increase the river temperatures. So here's an example of humans changing the climate impacting the survivability of a species. And, salmon are important species. So, the negative effects from climate change does not always just appear as, increasing temperatures, increasing CO2 levels, increasing, acidity of the ocean. It's the subtle changes in other aspects, the precipitation type, the amount, the deposition when it melts, and what's the flow rate, melt rate, what's the form, precipitation, etc. Something like that. You can change that. Little subtle changes like that will result in putting major stresses on habitats that were dependent on a previous condition that does not appear to be what it was historically. So there you have it. And again, this paper has been published 28th of June and in Geophysical Research Letters. I will leave the URL in the comments section. So there you have it. Climate change due to global warming will change precipitation patterns and amounts, and that can mess up organisms that rely on, no longer dependable conditions. Thank you for your time.